Welcome to Realms Unknown, a sci-fi and fantasy podcast brought to you by The Bugle. The younglings lined up at the starting chamber for the lion race. Those who finished would be acknowledged by the city fathers as men, would be allowed to cut their hair short and run their households, own property, collect wives, vote. Of course, the richer and better fed younglings strutted and preened, oiled and bound and prepared at home by servants, shod in leather with protective greaves on shins and forearms, certain they would make it through the bronze jaws of the lion by nightfall and receive their manhood. But Alyssa stood quietly to the side with the others from the poor and artisan classes, boys and girls alike, all the children of women, preparing themselves for the test, binding feet and chests in leather ribbons or thick cloth, speaking quietly of strategies and chants. Alyssa remembered waking in the night to see Mother coming home, big and bearded and gentle, working late 6 nights a week at the smithy to take care of her family, wondering how such a strong woman could ever have failed this race. How could Alyssa, small and dark and swift, hope to compete with her mother, who of all people had deserved to be a man? She didn't know. All she knew was that once she'd started this race, she had only one way out. She would end this day a man, or she'd take revenge on Realms Unknown. Welcome to Realms Unknown, a weekly speculative fiction podcast brought to you by The Bugle, in which we discuss science fiction and fantasy tropes, the newest news, our favourite old shows, books, games, and more. I am your host, published author and comedian Alice Fraser, and my companion on this journey, the Genly AI to my Estroven, the Makoya to my Akeha, the Breck to my Savaden, the Mulan to my Genderbending. It is author and journalist Patrick Lenton. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a delight to have you here. We're going to jump first into our news section, and I know this news is close to your heart. The news that the Wheel of Time series is being cancelled. Just as it was getting good.
Just as it was getting really, really good as well. You know, I didn't think it would survive past the first season, which had some real issues, and then it hit its stride, and I'm just devastated, to be honest.
I mean, yeah, the first season had the actor, and then they were filming during COVID, and so they had issues with sort of the connections and the chemistry between actors who may or may not have been in the same rooms while filming and all of that stuff. So you sort of gave them a pass for season one, and then you thought, oh, they're getting into it, and we were just about to get into the really sort of dark and interesting part of the journey, at least to my recollection. I read The Wheel of Time a long time ago, but it was like, I was like, oh, it's about to get really fun, and Rosamund Pike is so good, and heartbreaking.
It's, I mean, I do a lot of writing on television, so I'm used to everything being cancelled. But this is maybe the one show that I've been actively evangelizing, being like, everyone needs to watch this. We need to make sure that this doesn't get cancelled. And what did they do?
They managed, I thought that losing Matt and having him replaced by another actor would be the end of it. But I adjusted so easily to that. I was like, oh yeah, it's all make-believe. I even got over the idea that the Two Rivers was quite an ethnically open place. I mean, in my mind, it had been a very sort of monoculture, and then he was the only one who was different. And then I was like, no, it's cool. We're race blind casting. I like this. Actually, there's a choice. We can go with this. And then I was like, no, it's gone. It's gone.
It was very fascinating watching the things that they just decided to, either subtly change or completely ignore from the books. There is so much in those books that they were able to use as source material. And just the things that they said, no. Race blind casting, fantastic. Women, we'll put those in,
Yeah. Occasional women, and let's put their tits away.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Robert Jordan just loved a scene where all the ladies have their tits out for a reason. Very
Yes.
important culturally to have your tits out.
It's also the primary way that women expressed emotions in those books. If they were angry, their bosoms sort of heaved angrily, but then they also, if they were happy, I guess they, I don't know, flopped around. I'm not sure.
Yeah, to be fair, as someone now, if I think of my baby too much, my boobs let me know about it. So maybe it is, in fact, how it works. Yeah, I definitely read so much male-dominated fantasy as a child that it never bothered me at all. I was like, oh, well, women are weird, aren't we? Um, it's confusing to me to have an author in text have so many tits. Because you're like, You're just saying like you're not you're not seeing them. You're just imagining seeing them. Like
It's a lonely job being an author, I guess. I guess he was really just sitting there thinking about tits.
yeah, as do we all sometimes. Sometimes you just need to take an afternoon to yourself and imagine some ladies dancing around with their shirts off for culture. Our next news story is a little bit on the more depressing side, which is a fantasy author who's self-published has been called out for using AI after leaving a prompt in the published book. And the prompt read, "Make this chapter more like my work." Um, how do you feel about that?
Just like so viscerally embarrassed for this person, and not in a like, oh, it'll be okay. Like, I'm embarrassed for them and they should be shamed. I can't think of anything lazier or more morally bankrupt than using AI in fiction, especially.
Well, specifically using AI to make the text more in your own style, like by it's sort of there's sort of an odd combination of arrogance, the idea that a robot would know what you'd do in the circumstances and do it better than you can bring yourself to do. And then the sort of fundamental laziness revealed by not even deleting the prompt. I mean, if you're going to pull off a heist of this kind of a morality heist, don't then leave the thing in. You've locked yourself in the vault, like what have you what have you done? The heist metaphor has gotten away from me.
Yeah, I think I mean AI is going to be an escalating problem for authors in particular, and this is a pretty banal example of that because it's not really, like it's not really harming that many people, but it is harming her reputation, and it should. We should shame any author who relies on AI, because there needs to be a differentiation between what a human creative can do and what an AI can do. Otherwise, we will all be out of jobs.
It feels like, to me, the point of art is that art is the trace that the work of art leaves. So, the art gives you a sense of where the mind behind the art is and what they're doing, and it's a sort of a communication to some degree, and it draws us all into the shared experience of humanity. And to me, the interest of a work of art is like seeing someone has planted a flag at the top of Everest is much less interesting to me to know that someone has dropped a flag with a helicopter.
Mm.
There's nothing to that for me. I mean, maybe the person who invented the helicopter, the person who writes an AI algorithm might be admirable for their creativity, but for the person who's writing it, not necessarily. And I think there are plenty of people with good ideas, but not a lot of discipline, who think, well, the only thing getting in the way of me and my success as an artist is, this irrelevant thing of actually sitting down and doing the work.
Mm.
But to me, that's the thing that is the difference. I've had 8 million great ideas, and they are worth nothing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing is that even though she was using herself as a prompt, that doesn't mean because AI is built off the plagiarism of other works, in ways that we can't see. So using AI does actually capitalize on other people's work, even with yourself as a prompt, which is getting to even more sort of problematic things. It's not just lazy. Now we're getting into stealing and theft.
Yeah, well, you might have a licensing agreement with an author to use their work if, for example, you could track what bits of an author's work you were using, which, I mean, you know what would be really good at tracking what parts of an author's work it was using? Some sort of AI might be really good at telling you what pieces it had put together. But apparently, if you have to pay for the work that you're using, it is an untenable business model. So to me, that says that you don't have a business.
Yeah, yeah. I think also in self-publishing, this is going to be a huge issue because there are, not that we've seen plenty of examples of publishing houses not particularly doing their due diligence around plagiarism or just people making things up, when it comes to like nonfiction stories that are just completely untrue, Bell Gibson cancer story, etc. But there are some checks and balances in a traditional publishing format, whereas within self-publishing, people can just literally do what they want, upload them, and then sell them, And so we have no idea if people are going to be using completely AI generated things. Hopefully the market will respond because people will be like, wow, that sucked and I hated it. I'm not going to buy another one. But, who knows?
Well, I guess after a while you couldn't just get your wives to write it for you anymore, so our final piece of news in the news section is that the live action remake of Lilo and Stitch is doing very well in cinemas, better than expected. Apparently, it is a cross-generational appeal, despite the fact that it was originally not the most successful of the Disney animation offerings. As a sort of a children's sci-fi take, I feel like Stitch is kind of the original minion, but also following something of an ET storyline. I am for this. I'm sort of anti the live action reboots because I think they're a bit creepy. Where do you fall on that?
Yeah, I also find the live action reboots particularly unappealing. And as a childless adult, it doesn't particularly impact me because I don't have to see them. But I think it's one of those things where I understand exactly what the business model is, which is that children are new and they haven't seen anything at all. So why not just use the existing franchise and then reboot it slightly and earn more money from them because, they're not going to be saying, well, I already saw this 10 years ago because they didn't exist.
I recommend that all parents do what I'm doing, which is to introduce their children to televisual media chronologically. So
Mm.
start with Buster Keaton, move your way up from there.
Yeah, the film of the train coming through the screen that scared
Ah,
everyone. Yeah, take your kids to that first.
yep, yep, yep. No, a 1-year-old is not going to be excited by that unless they've never seen anything else, in which case it's the most exciting thing they've ever seen. And that brings us to your ad section. Your ad section now, because you can't be what you can't buy. And this episode of the podcast is brought to you by Ingmar Enderby's explosive emotional support drones. If you've repressed till you can repress no more, try Ingmar Enderby's explosive emotional support drones. They listen, they judge, they carry your emotional baggage, and if needed, they explode, creating enough of a distraction that no one will even notice you having a quiet cry. Perfect for emotionally constrained assassins, heartless antiheroes, and Jason Stathams. Or Jason's Statham, depending on how plural your Stathams are. Endorsed by Gideon Nav from Gideon the Ninth and all other protagonists who'd rather die than admit to having feelings. And this episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Androgynous Orphan Smudge Everyday Carry Kit, the all-purpose disguise for a girl born to the harsh streets of downtown Megaloptropolis, a place where it's not a good idea to be a girl. Full kit comes with thieving cant, vocab book, knife skills, and the ability to say oi like the rest of your Fagin gang of street boys. Does not include excuses to pee in private, so make sure you restrain yourself to half a glass of water at a time until you can establish a routine. And if you're listening to this, you probably like me, and maybe you like books or games or shows. Did you know I wrote a book and there's a show about the book, and I'm doing it to launch the book in Australia? I will be in Sydney on the 28th of June, in Melbourne on the 27th of June, in Brisbane on the 29th of June. I did those Junes in the wrong order. And then I'll also be in Perth and Adelaide the next weekend. Look up my dates on patreon.com/Alice Fraser or by Googling them. Google A Passion for Passion. You can put it on pre-order at your local bookshop. It's going to be in Australia in paperbacks. It's in the US and the UK and Canada and Ireland. You can get it all over the world now, which is quite exciting. Someone sent me a picture of it in an Irish library, which delighted me. So make that available to yourselves. Patrick, what have you been doing into your brain on the fantasy and sci-fi side of late?
Okay, this fantasy series that I got introduced to recently that absolutely blew my mind is the Scholomance series by Naomi Novik.
Yes.
Yeah. I know I'm late to the party, but that's one of the, like, the greatest things when you're like, "Oh, cool, I love this," and there's a whole series ready to read.
I will read anything by Naomi Novik. I didn't Naomi Novik, I didn't get into the Temeraire series as much as I would have liked. I would have said it's super up my alley. Master and Commander with Dragons, if you don't know. But Spinning Silver, incredible. The Scholomance series, incredible. Just what a great writer. What a great turn on the trope. What a great magic school story.
Yes, there's been a huge need to subvert the magical school genre in so many ways, and I think that Lev Grossman did it with The Magicians in a really, like, gritty, kind of adult way, but I really like how this basically takes it back to that kinda young coming of age, school is hell idea, and then just really flips it on its head and just, like, I thought it was gonna be when I sort of read the concept, I kinda thought it might be a bit cutesy, like, and, like, the stakes might not really impact because it was like, "Oh, it's," how, like, it's a bit of a crazy concept, and the more I read, the more I was like, "I'm so much more deeply invested in this than some other wizard school books that I might name."
I could read another 7 books in the same series. I want to know what happens to the whole thing, but I thought it wrapped up really nicely and really well, and I cannot wait for someone to make 1 season of it and then get it cancelled.
That is entirely true. I think there is really a scope for it as a TV series, but it's also like my little heart might not be able to handle it.
But, I mean, it's sort of the perfect like, it's so perfectly written for television because it's in a lockbox for at least the first season where they're trapped in this school, so you have a set and you can it's the Star Trek bottle episode solution to everyone's problems other than, a few flashbacks in the Welsh hinterlands. You've got it all stuck in a box. Come on,
Yeah.
bring it. I have been reading Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wang, which was originally indie published, and then it was picked up by a trad publisher because it was very popular. It's sort of the story of an isolated city who powers their electricity by drawing it from the other land using sort of essentially coding, and it's the first female coder for a very, very long time. But it's got all these themes of kind of colonialism and technology, and the themes are a little bit heavy-handed when it comes to sort of everyone is dealing with oppression in their own ways, but overall, it's really well written and really satisfying. I recommend it, and also, for the first time, I went to visit my dad, and he has Disney Plus, so I watched a couple of episodes of Andor, which late to the party, but it's great. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yes, I am a massive fan. That was my other selection, which is that I've finished Andor, and it has the dubious honor of being one of the 3 TV shows I've ever cried in.
That is a great honor. I'm sure anyone who wrote except unless you're crying because it's really bad.
No, I was crying because I was so emotionally affected by, a specific episode, which I won't spoil, but yeah.
Yeah, they seem to have managed to sort of do this occasion like, this thing that we all hope is possible, which is take the big money and the big name and run with it and do something genuinely interesting with a really clear authorial voice, a really beautiful kind of teamwork, which I imagine the team is bigger than anyone really wants to work with, but that whoever the director is seems to have got them all in a line and managed to make something genuinely new.
I'd be so interested in reading a, like, behind the scenes or oral history or something of it, because I imagine that that show, in order to get made to such a high degree of, brilliance and creativity, basically involves someone going in and, like, beating Disney, producers and, like, the top Disney brass, I don't know, to death, and then, like, hiding the body so that they don't interfere and, and be like, "Well, we need more lightsabers," and, like, "Can we get Jar Jar Binks back?"
Well, I don't know if you saw the Han Solo prequel, but it fell victim to a thing that a lot of these big franchises do with sequels, which had great actors and, incredible graphics and so on and so forth. but the whole story was just them collecting gear, all the iconic gear. And you think, well, you know how this story ends, so you can make the stakes incredibly high. Start the Han Solo story by having his legs chopped off or having him do something completely morally unfixable, like something you cannot come back from. And
Yeah.
then see the journey to how he becomes the kind of guy who's willing to become the kind of guy who we see him become in the Star Wars sequels. But they didn't do that. They just were like, and then you wonder how he got that gun, don't you? And I was like, no, it never occurred to me to wonder how he got that gun. I don't care. And inevitably it will be disappointing because it could have been anything and now it's something, and whatever it is not infinite possibility. Not
Yeah.
to be Coleridge at you. Excellent. So that's a double vote for Naomi Novik's Scholomance series and for Andor. That brings us to Trope on a Rope. Patrick, is there something that you particularly enjoy every time you encounter it or that just infuriates you?
Okay. The trope that I hate is finishing or like rounding up a story and then revealing a baby.
You would hate romance novels.
I love romance novels, but it's a trope that I don't particularly love in romance either. But particularly in fantasy and sci-fi, one of the things that I don't like about it is that like it's kind of a trite, sentimental way of being like of it's often in the way of honoring a sacrifice or like, or it's like it's okay that like the main character or the main character's best friend died because look, he lives on in this child. It's like, oh, couldn't he live on in his deeds, like or just not die after all? Like
I have never missed dead people more than when I had a newborn baby.
I know that they did it in the superhero TV series Arrow. Like at the end of that, they kind of were like, and surprise, there's a baby. And it's just I think it can often be done in a way too sentimental way, and it can often be done in a way that is kind of lazy storytelling. Like even actually the end of Charmed, that was they basically were like, and it's a happy, like, and we're all happy because this is ending and everyone has children now. Every single Charmed sister has 1,000 children. And that was basically how they sort of like, they wrapped that up. And it's not against the idea of children. It's just that last moment of like, and like, ah,
Children is shorthand for happily ever after when children are actually shorthand for now, oh wow, now there's a whole new set of challenges ahead.
yes. Yeah, exactly. It's very, yeah, it's very much, it's exactly that. It is that, that shorthand happy ever after. And then and I think in fantasy and sci-fi, it's like, it's often used in that way of like, oh, but the sacrifice, it was all worth it. It's like, well, I don't think they did it so they could have a child, but sure.
Well, I'll tell you one, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I do notice it every time it happens. And it is actually in sci-fi and fantasy, but it does cross over into romantasy and romantic sci-fi and romance novels as general, which is the fitting with the theme of this week's subgenre deep dive. Only he can tell she's a girl,
Yes.
which is, if you don't know, that is where our protagonist female character is in disguise as a boy, and everyone falls for it except for the hero who can smell her musk, tell from the way she walks, tell from the fact that he's attracted to her that she is a girl. I think is probably not my favorite. I would much prefer it be either a convincing disguise or an unconvincing disguise. Either everyone knows or no one knows. Mulan does quite well on that.
I was just about to say, I was like, the example I think is good in that is Milan.
Yeah. Well, I think my favorite version of that is where she's been a boy for so long, then she has to really come to terms with being a girl again. Even she sort of believes it.
Yeah, right.
And that brings us to interesting discussions about gender, which is, interestingly enough, our subgenre deep dive for this week. We are slightly restructuring the subgenre deep dive section. As some listeners have said, the cascade of recommendations is a little bit overwhelming. But Basically, we're going to talk about the subgenre and discuss what's good and bad about it and some examples. But if this is really your bag and you want a longer reading list, which many people do, I put up a post on my Patreon every week, up on Blue Sky as well. You can subscribe to the Patreon for free. I use it to fund my writers' meetings, but it's also just a place that isn't algorithm to death for me to keep all my stuff. Mostly functions as a mailing list, and I write one article a week there. Anyway, I announced the subgenre deep dive topic over there a few days before the recording, and people put their recommendations in the comments, and I put my recommendations there. So it's a valuable resource, a nice place to have discoverability buddies, as Fated Mates podcast calls it. But our subgenre deep dive for this week is sci-fi and fantasy that does interesting things with gender. I think sci-fi and fantasy have for a while been a really good place to play out ideas and experiments with gender, whether it's imagining a society where women are considered and treated as the more aggressive sex, for example, as in The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, or doing away entirely with fixed binary gender in favor of some other format, like in The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin or Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie, in which the Ratch language makes no distinction between men and women. And the text plays that out by defaulting to she, her pronouns for everyone across the board, or having characters without gender, as in the Murderbot Diaries, or exaggerating gender to the utmost degree, as in some very bad fantasy and sci-fi. But whether it's a gender-bending manga or a classic boys' own fantasy adventure with only boys, it can definitely be done in a way that turns your head inside out about its own assumptions about biology and sex and gender, or it can be heavy-handed and self-consciously over-virtuous, and sometimes a bit of both. Patrick, do you have a favorite gender bending recommendation?
A lot of why I was kind of thinking about this topic recently is because I went and did a full reread of The Wheel of Time in honor of how much I enjoyed the TV series. I've read The Wheel of Time since I was a teenager, but I had not read it, I guess, in the last 15 years, maybe. And I was like, once again, shocked at just how amazing the gender essentialism in the books is, and how it comes from this very interesting blend of like kind of insidious misogynistic thinking, because a lot of it is very paternal, like very patronizingly paternal, but the interesting thing is that he's really engaging, like he is trying to engage with the ideas of gender, and he's really trying to engage with the idea of gender roles and things like that, and just coming to some pretty weird conclusions, I feel. And so then I was really looking at how the TV show subverted, kind of ingrained misogyny in a fantasy text. And it wasn't just about flipping the female characters into position of more power, because a lot of those characters already had the power. It was just flipping how the other characters engaged with that, but also respond to the power as well. And so, yeah, I was really thinking of that, and also in a similar way, the subversion that happens in Rings of Power by putting so much focus on Galadriel.
Yeah, very interesting. I think it happens more often and more interestingly in books than in television. There are a few really good examples of gender bending. I'm going to call back to Xena Warrior Princess, where they played quite a lot with sort of gender bending, often having an excuse for Xena to kiss Gabrielle because she thought she was a man or was in the body of one of Ares or something. So that was all quite like clunkily done, but it sort of raises these questions where some of the like semiotics of film makes it difficult to have gender neutral characters or characters that aren't immediately gendered. You have now like non-binary actors who are playing one gender or the other, but still I don't think we have a filmic language that's super sophisticated for dealing with that. Actually, manga is a place where it gets done fairly often. You have characters that flip between genders, and like getting to select sex in games and online avatars is something that I think is informing modern discussions about gender performance more than a lot of people acknowledge. But in terms of books that do it, I think probably one of my earliest encounters would be a Lois McMaster Bujold book called Ethan of Athos, where our central character is born on a world of men. The sci-fi technology that is predicates the world is that you have uterine replicators. So different societies you deal with that in different ways. It means you don't need women to incubate babies. And so there's this one planet that is all men for religious reasons, and they have characterized women as the devil. And our lead character is Ethan, and he works in a replicator hospital, and he brings children into the world, and he's saving up social credits to be able to afford to have a child with his partner. And the way that the society sort of has to acknowledge the labor that goes into childcare, that is because they have to raise children with two men, it sort of puts all of that work onto the surface. And then, of course, something goes wrong and he has to go off planet and encounter, women. And the woman who he encounters is a female mercenary who's sort of obviously, in many ways, non-gender conforming, but coming from a society where she's constantly fighting against assumptions about how women ought to behave. So that's a lot of fun. That's Lois McMaster Bujold's Ethan of Athos. Do you have any other recommendations?
It's an oldie and it is outdated in a lot of ways, but it was really interesting as a kind of like jumping off point for this kind of conversation. The Honor Harrington series by David Weber, did you ever read those?
Yes, lots of fun.
Yeah, like they're a really fun space opera, but like I remember reading those when I was like in my early teens and reading interviews with David Weber, and there was like this real question of like, why are you writing a strong like a strong woman character? Like, like what's your agenda here? And he really was in a lot of ways not prepared for that kind of response, I think, because he was basically just saying, I just wrote a normal male space opera hero and then made her female. And now that's being seen as some sort of weird revolutionary feminist act for the 90s, I guess. And I think that is a really fascinating kind of artifact to look on, and it really does engage with with ideas of misogyny. Like one of the enemy kind of space nations is religious zealots who have misogyny ingrained in their teachings, and so Honor Harrington's actual existence as like literally the most capable person in the entire universe. Like now it would be really considered a bit like overkill because like not only is she the best at flying spaceships and strategy and tactics and stuff, she's also the best at shooting and swords and governing small nations. I don't know. It's like it's really like it is crazy, but like he kind of had to do that at the time in order to sort of like navigate very sort of basic ideas around like gender subversion. And I think it's fascinating and and still a really fun read.
Well, it is really interesting that science fiction, everything from sort of Dax in Deep Space Nine to Honor Harrington seems to be a more fertile place for playing with ideas about gender than fantasy, which tends, there's some people who say the difference between science fiction and fantasy is that science fiction looks forward and fantasy looks back. But there's certainly, a plethora of fantasy books in which it's all boys. I mean, other than all elves are girls and all dwarfs are boys, kind of in assumption, but, you know, I'm gonna give a recommendation that people are probably already screaming at their iPhones that they're listening to this on. Obviously, the way that Terry Pratchett deals with Cheery Littlebottom in the Discworld series, particularly in the Night Guards part of it, is just brilliant. It's so satirical, it's so gentle, it's so kind, it's, like, so humane. I think that you could do worse than looking at that for an example of how to deal with discussions about gender, and again, written quite a while ago, um, but more advanced than a lot of the discussions that are being had now.
Yeah. Another quick recommendation is a book I just read called Ladies' Night by Amy Kaufman. And it is once again, an idea of a subverted gender fantasy novel where basically a woman enters a night tournament, pretending to be a man. But what's really good about this, what I really loved about that is that it didn't follow the kind of logic of just a simple subversion of gender. It also it's also a very queer, lots of women loving women in it, which is fantastic as well. But it actually really queers the idea of how a subverted gendered novels can kind of go, and it took it in a really unexpected place. And I just loved it.
Excellent. I might have to read that now. If you want more recommendations, of course, we could go on all night. If you want more recommendations, head over to the Blue Sky or to the Patreon and see the extended reading list provided by you, the listener. I always find myself with far too much on my to be read list after plunging in there. That brings us to the minds of where we talk about things that we loved at various times in our life, but now in retrospect, a little bit. Patrick, have you got one for us?
Yeah, I'm still kind of grieving this, but one of my favorite fantasy series for a really long time was the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, which I just think is such a brilliant next level concept. He doesn't he doesn't coddle the readers in any way. He just throws you in and he expects you to catch up. And every point that you catch up, it's worth it. You're like, fantastic. I felt challenged by him in a way that I haven't felt challenged by, and I felt swept up in this giant world. But unfortunately, it depicts so much sexual violence that by the end of the series, in particular, there is like some particularly excessive scenes. I was like, I don't think I can ever read this again. There's this one, like, I think it might be maybe the last two books. There is one particular arc for a beloved character, and it's just all based around sexual violence. And I'm just like, I don't see why this is necessary, and it's so confronting and awful.
Yeah, I find that, particularly grimdark can tend that way because sexual violence is such a shorthand for unrestrained and unregulated urges of the baddies or even of the weaker people in the plots. I found with George R. Martin, I could not get through what was otherwise very appealing because you go, okay, the first time an underage person gets sexually assaulted by a relative could be construed as a mistake. Like the fifth time, it's just something you enjoy writing about. You've made the point. I get it.
Mm.
Do we need to uh, keep doing it? So I found myself sort of skipping bigger and bigger chunks of George R. Martin's work. But that's okay because so does he. Would you still recommend Malazan Book of the Fallen, even with the
With like a massive content warning, I will sort of say to people, I'm like, look, I've read fantasy all my life. I'm pretty inured to how fantasy can go in those sorts of ways. Like I've read Game of Thrones and was, honestly pretty fine with it, which might make me a monster. But this particular series really affected me. Like there are some scenes where I'm like, I would actually do something, like I would give money to get that out of my head now, So yeah, with a massive content warning.
massive content warning? Only read it if you can either flag the pages ahead of time and know what you're in for. I'm a big watching something with someone, I shut my eyes and I say tap me when it's over because I'm fully aware there's some things you can't get out of your head.
Mm.
My Minds of is a classic. The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley is
Oh.
revolutionary feminist reclamation of the Arthurian myth. It centers Morgana Le Fay, Morgaine, and Guinevere and Vivienne. They're sort of these complicated figures. It sort of talks about the myth of Arthur rising up as a manifestation of sort of patriarchal dominance over traditional pagan and female-led mysticisms. So like a cultural shift from matriarchy to male-dominated rule, and that's why Morgana Le Fay is then cast as the evil witch. There's two ways that I now first of all is there's quite a lot of kind of biological essentialism, like all men are brutes and all women are sort of mystical and magical. Morgaine's worth is sort of tied to her fertility and her motherhood, even though it's ostensibly this feminist reclamation. It romanticizes some abuse dynamics, and there's sort of some dubious consent, which, in light of Marion Zimmerman Bradley's criminal reality, then becomes sort of impossible to really sort of forgive. In the context of the text, it is uncomfortable, but in the context of the text being written by somebody who was a criminal, I just can't. And I remember loving it when I read it, and it sort of turned. I love the Arthurian myth. I have such fun with it, and I enjoy sort of every iteration of it. And this kind of turned everyone inside out, and Arthur's a baddie all of a sudden, and that's a really fun thing when your mindset gets flipped and you have to think of things in a new way. And so I really enjoyed it when I read it, and I don't think I can recommend it now.
Yeah, I also absolutely loved those books, and I was thinking about them recently when I read Lev Grossman's The Bright Sword, which is another Arthurian legend fantasy take, and I was like, oh, I should go back and read those, and then like as I was thinking that, I went, oh no.
Yeah. Yeah, which is the thing, for me, the Minds of is a way of kind of reckoning with a conversation that I don't enjoy, which is like people calling things problematic and just going, put them in the bin, they're problematic. And you're like, well, but what's the actual problem? Can we put a finger on it? And can we figure out if we can still read Tintin despite Tintin? But yeah, this is one where I think this is the first one in my Minds of that I just can't recommend. Even though it was very good and probably still is very good, but I can't do it.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. That brings us to the end of this week's episode. A reminder to subscribe to this show in the Bugle channel, to subscribe to the Bugle channel as a whole. All the books that we cover here are in the affiliate store. Their link is in the show notes, and we talk about all of the things everywhere over on the Patreon and the Blue Sky, so please come and chat with us. For an action item adventurer, why not dive into Patrick's recommendation of Naomi Novik's Scholomance Trilogy, which subverts the magic school genre in a brilliant way. I double recommend that. Please read it. I cannot imagine you not enjoying it. If you read it and don't enjoy it, send me an email at realmsunknown@thebuglepodcast.com and tell me why. If you want to experience the evolution of gender roles from book to television, then read The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, then watch the TV adaptation, then watch it again. Maybe they'll uncancel it. Or try the Honorverse series, where David Webber writing Honor Harrington as a normal space opera hero was seen at the time as a weird revolutionary feminist act. Patrick Lenton, have you got anything to plug?
Yes, I have my debut novel coming out in August. It's called In Spite of You, and it is a queer rom-com.
That sounds delightful. I'll put it on pre-order now. You can find me online at patreon.com/Alice Fraser. It's a one-stop shop full of West Adult specials, podcasts and blogs, as well as my weekly salons and my 4 times weekly writers' meetings. If you want to write with a really nice gang of people, you can do that there. Patreon.com/Alice Fraser. You can subscribe for free. This is a Bugle podcast and Alice Fraser production. Your editor is Ped Hunter. Your executive producer is Chris Skinner. I'll talk to you again next week.